Hello. So in today's lesson, we are looking at how did England change under the Normans? We've got two learning objectives: to understand how the Normans changed the law and why they did this, and to understand how law enforcement and punishments changed and stayed the same in Norman England. So you have got in Google Classroom two quizzes to complete. One is called How Did the Normans Change the Law in England? And the other one is called How Did the Normans Deal with Criminals? Now, you're going to be told when to complete each of these. Please don't run off and do it before the lesson begins. That's madness. Read the questions carefully. You'll only get one attempt, so really take your time with this one. If you need to go back from the video, you feel free to do so. And as always, any questions you've got with today's lesson, feel free to contact me, gbrown@stopseyhighschool.co.uk. So, if you remember, when William became King of England in 1066, do you remember studying the Battle of Hastings with William? Good. This began the rule of the Normans, and that's because William was from Normandy in France. So England's changed from Anglo-Saxon England, so Anglo-Saxons were the English people at the time, to Norman England, when the Normans invaded. There was a Norman king and there were Normans in England, so French people in England. So we see a shift from Anglo-Saxon England to Norman England. A Norman king, Normans were now coming over to stay, people from Normandy in France. Now, William wanted to show his power, and this was done in several ways. First of all, dealing with rebellions, and you might remember covering this as well before. William faced rebellions from the north of England. The people in the north of England did not want him to be their new king. They did not want a French person in charge of them. They didn't accept him. And so, William used brute force to deal with these rebellions. William wanted to show his power as king was without limits, that he could do things no other person could do. And so he ordered for farmlands to be destroyed and animals to be killed. He wanted to deal with all of the people who were rebelling against him. Now, after these food shortages were caused by William, about 100,000 people starved to death in the north of England. That is a staggering amount of people. Britain wasn't as heavily populated back then. And this event was called the Harrying of the North. Now, by doing this, William showed how the king had the most power in England. The king was the most powerful individual and he could create the laws alone. These were extreme punishments. Not everyone killed was a rebel. Large amounts of people not directly involved in the rebellion, thousands of innocent people, were also killed as a result. It's similar to at school when the teacher says, if the person who did this doesn't own up, the whole class will be punished. The whole class will have to stay back. It's a similar thing here. William basically had to make sure he could kill the rebels, and so innocent people suffered as well. Another law change was murderum. So what word does that look like, murderum? Hopefully you've worked out that's the word murder there. And this is where we start to see it come into play in England. Now, unsurprisingly, the English were not happy about French Normans being in their country. So it's hardly a surprise when Normans started to be killed in England. Now, this was a problem for William. He had to protect his fellow Normans from the English, the Anglo-Saxons. And so to do this, he made a new law called the murderum, or the murder law. And it went like this. If a Norman, a French person, was killed by an Anglo-Saxon, an English person, and the murderer was not found and executed, then a special penalty was paid called the murderum fine. Now, this was a huge sum of money, and this was paid for by the community where the body was found. Now, this caused panic. If you found a dead Norman in your village, you had to get rid of that body quickly before it got reported to William, before one of William's officials found out. And so there are medieval stories of people picking up this dead Norman body and throwing it into a river and it getting washed downstream to another Anglo-Saxon village, and then they had to panic and deal with the body. Now, the aim of this law was to stop people from killing Normans because it was not worth it. The amount they had to pay was crippling. And also, it was to make it less likely people would cover up these crimes. So if you knew someone in your village had killed the Norman, you were more likely to inform, to tell people they had done it, so they got in trouble and you didn't have to pay the fine. Another law was the forest laws. When William came to England, he started to look at the countryside, and he said that large areas were now royal forests, and they're shown on this map. And he said these new areas, these royal forests, are to be used for hunting by the royal family and their friends only. No one else is allowed in. So one example of this is the New Forest in Hampshire. William said, I want this forest for myself. And there were people living there at the time. There was about 40 different communities, small villages in the New Forest. And William basically said, out you lot go, don't care where you live, you're not here anymore. This is my property, I'm the king. He told them to resettle elsewhere. So this was a huge problem for many people in England at the time. Why was that the case? Because they had relied on the forest for centuries. It had been common land, it had been available to anyone to access for free. People had used this land to collect firewood, to let their animals graze, or even to catch rabbits. Now, only people who paid the king for hunting rights would be given permission to go on the lands. And it was made illegal for people who had not been given permission, that were found trespassing, carrying hunting weapons, removing anything from the land, even a branch for firewood, to get in serious trouble as a result. It was illegal for them to do this. This meant any hunting done by people without permission was a new crime, and that was called poaching. How was this enforced? Well, the king hired people to work as foresters, and they would patrol the forests and they would catch people who had not been given permission to work in the forest. People who were caught faced either capital punishment, the death penalty, such as being hung, or they faced corporal punishment, such as castration, which is where their private parts were cut off, and blinding, so they could no longer go back in the forest. So they would just cut the eyes out straight away of these people. And these punishments were harsh. These are extreme punishments. And the reason is William did not want people on his New Forest, his hunting grounds. William made these punishments harsh to scare people into not trespassing. So what did the people do faced with this challenge? Well, as you can imagine, the people who used the land were very upset. Now, they felt the forest laws took away their basic rights. Everyone should have freedom to this land. It didn't belong to one person. They wanted access to the food on the land. They wanted access to the firewood on the land. And the problem that they faced was there was nowhere else for them to go. Their family for decades had used this land, and it's not like there's a Tesco Express around the corner for them to go and grab some food. So people still broke the law. People still hunted on the land, even with this possible face of death on them. They believed the king had stolen the land from them. And what's interesting is they were supported by ordinary people as well, people who didn't need that land to survive. But they saw the forest laws as unfair as well. This was not a law that was supported by many people in England at all. Many people did not look down or frown upon those that broke them. Most people did not respect this as a law. Most people did not care that this law was broken. And so that is what we call a social crime. So the forest laws became a social crime. That's when someone takes an action which, although it's against the law, most people in society do not disapprove of it. They don't report them for it. They don't find it horrific. So I guess in today's terms, it's quite difficult. I can't think of too many social crimes, possibly downloading. If you told me you'd illegally downloaded a song, I wouldn't raise an eyebrow to that. I wouldn't necessarily care. If you tell me you've killed someone, there's a difference there, isn't there, straight away? So social crimes are when most people do not disapprove of them being broken. And this was an example with the forest laws. People still risked their lives. People still went and hunted on the king's land. And a lot of people in England didn't care that this happened. Okay, so that is the first section of this lesson. So can you go to task 1? Can you go to the quiz? How did the Normans change the law in England? Please make sure you pick the right one and then answer those questions. The slides with the pink background will help if you need to go back at all. Pause the video here and then press play to continue. Okay, so moving on then to look at punishments and law enforcement. So what punishments changed? Well, the Saxons had set a system up for people who killed others, and they would have to pay a huge fine, like compensation to that family. And the Saxons called this the Wergild. Were means man, like werewolf. Guild means price, so man price is compensation. Now, the Normans kept this system, but with one small change. Rather than the money going to the victims' families to compensate them, that money now went to the king, and it was seen as a penalty for breaking the king's peace, for causing trouble for the king. So the victims of crime no longer got the money, it was the king instead. Now, why is this important? Because this shows the king having more authority in crime and punishment. This shows the king's power again. And William created more crimes punishable by death or mutilation. Though when we say mutilation, we mean body parts being cut off, for example, a hand, as we can see in this picture, or branding, when they would take things like a hot iron that's been in the fire, it's white hot, and they would brand your face or your ear and leave severe burn marks. Now, this increase in punishments was because William wanted the people of England to behave, and other Norman kings after him wanted the same thing. The idea was the harsher the punishments, and the more punishments there were, it would scare people into behaving or obeying. But one change that was brought in by William was trial by combat. Now, trial by combat was when people had a disagreement over something such as money or land. This tended to be used by wealthy people who felt this was a more dignified way to settle their differences than something like trial by ordeal where they would have to burn themselves. Now, how did it work? People would fight each other using swords or sticks until there was a winner. And there would often be spectators, as you can see in this picture. This was a fight to the death. If you gave in, you would just be killed. So only one person leaves that arena. Now, the idea is that these people were so religious that they believed God would be on their side. It didn't matter how fierce the opponent was or how large the opponent was. God knew you were innocent, so God would make sure you would win. The reality of this was that tough and jealous males, and it was just males that did this, they could accuse wealthy neighbours of theft because they wanted their money. They could kill them in trial by combat and then take their money afterwards. Now, trial by combat was seen as both law enforcement, because God was determining who had won, as we can see this symbolised in this picture here, God standing over the victor. So God is enforcing the law. God is making sure that the guilty person loses. And it could be seen as punishment, because the guilty person would be killed. So trial by combat was law enforcement to find out if someone was guilty or not, and it was the punishment as well. Speaking of law enforcement, well, obviously there was no police force in Norman England. So what happened if a crime was committed? Well, William kept the same systems in place in England that had been there for decades before, because they worked well. And that is, the community was responsible for making sure the law was enforced in their own separate areas. So there's no police force. In your small community, it is the job of each person to enforce the law. How does this work? Well, every male over the age of 12 had to be part of a group called a tithing in their area. And a tithing would have up to 10 people in it. When you reach your 10 in one tithing, you start another one. Now, you keep a close eye on everyone in your tithing. If someone in your tithing is ever accused of committing a crime and needs to be brought to justice, it is your job in that tithing, the other 9 people, to find that person and make sure they're brought forward for justice, like a big game of manhunt. And if you failed to do that, you would be in trouble as well. What this means is you kept a close eye on people in your tithing. You didn't want the aggro of having to go and find someone. So if you felt someone was a troublemaker in your tithing, you kept an eye on them. You made sure they behaved. The other system in place was the hue and cry. If you saw a crime being committed, you would shout out for help. Now, if you heard the cry, you had to help chase the suspect. You couldn't just walk away or pretend you didn't hear anything. This was known as the hue and cry. People's job to chase suspects down. So, that is task 2 on the board for you there. Complete the quiz. How did the Normans deal with criminals? Can you please complete that second quiz now? If you need to go back, the yellow slides are there. Pause the video here and then press play to complete the final part of this lesson. Okay, so hopefully you've completed both of those quizzes. How did the Normans change the law in England, and how did the Normans deal with crimes? Thank you very much for completing today's lesson. Any questions you've got, feel free to contact me, gbrown@stopseyhighschool.co.uk. And all that remains for me to say is look after yourself, get some fresh air and exercise where you can, and I'll see you soon. Take care and all the best. Bye-bye.